Hare Krishna, and thank you for allowing me to speak. They say that you can tell a fool when he opens his mouth. So I'm a little bit nervous. I have an actual personal experience with propaganda because my mother and her husband, my father died when I was young, they actually began an institute for propaganda research back in the early 80s. They had seen a lot of Soviet propaganda being pumped into the libraries and to the school curriculums. They developed a very large library that has since been donated to an institution. And in fact, they had many encounters with politicians and scholars analyzing the way in which propaganda insidiously was injected into the consciousness of the social order. So I'm going to kind of approach it just so that you know that background of mine. And as far as 101, it's a very deep subject. I'm going to do it skim the surface as quickly as I can. And where are we here? Oh, okay. Do you want to give me that? I'll do it for you. Okay, next. So let's define what propaganda is according to how it's understood. We use English because Prabhupada was given that language to preach. He was instructed. So English is really our foundational language. We think it's Sanskrit, but actually that for us is where we have to look to Prabhupada's instructions. So propaganda is the spreading of information in support of a cause. Propaganda is often used in a negative sense, especially for politicians who make false claims. Anybody come to mind? And get elected or spread rumors to get their way. In fact, any campaign that's used to persuade can be called propaganda. It's actually originated with the Catholic Church. And I think their canon law was propagated throughout their hegemony. Next. So here's what Prabhupada's references are. That's where we go to get a start, to get a kind of a domain of where we're going to understand propaganda. He uses it, at least from what I found in the Vanipedia, over almost 1,300 times. So he describes it in this way. It's very interesting. Gorgeous, systematic, false, preaching wrong, newspaper and television propaganda, vigorous propaganda, damaging propaganda, Krishna conscious propaganda, real, powerful, counter-enthusiastic propaganda, conquering propaganda, inside and outside propaganda, wrong propaganda, bogus, homosex propaganda, good, scientific, Christian, British, bad, organized, hearing, Sankaracharya's propaganda. Indirectly, that is our propaganda, chanting Hare Krishna. Real, large scale, nice, side by side, selling books is our propaganda. Next. So propaganda takes many forms. The Indians are encouraged to trust the United States government. Global warming, next. The Indian Army needs us. And the U.S. Army needs those of us who are not Indian. Next. World No Tobacco Day. It's a good thing, benevolent. Next. We can do it. Women's labor power during the war. Don't you lose your life to drugs. There's all kinds of propaganda that comes at us. Next. That's propaganda. All advertising is propaganda. What isn't propaganda? Next. It can be really, good. Advertising is good. It's good propaganda. Next. And of course, this was propaganda back in the early days. So propaganda is used for all kinds of purposes. Next. And we use it in our contemporary times. Next. And we spread Krishna consciousness through the use of propaganda. Next. So our point of propaganda should be that it's very good that you write this slogan, "In God We Trust." That's on the dollar bill in America, the US dollar. But nobody has got a clear conception of God, neither do not know what is the meaning of trust under the circumstances. So you have to learn it scientifically, and our propaganda is like that. Here's the best definition I found of what Prabhupada's his orientation towards our propaganda was: to teach actually what is God. Next. Next slide. So we have to make, Prabhupada says, some propaganda amongst them. Actually, it's the nicest possible thing. Simply they have to be convinced. That's a fact. Now people has to know how to make it known. Go to the newspaper, the magazine, the foundations. So one responsible, one, why one? 2, 3 men must move among them. And whenever required, if some big meeting is arranged, then I go also. And people should know about our activities, that we are not bogus. And Krishna consciousness is for everyone. It is not Hindu propaganda. He makes that distinction. Next. Now, in direct propaganda, the public is aware of the purpose of propagandists. You know when you see an ad for a car that it's the manufacturer of that car that wants you to become attracted by the contact of the senses, with the object of the senses. Attachment develops, so here's the contact, first contact. Campaigns taken up by the government, social organizations on family planning, literacy, women's welfare, dowerless marriage, education for all. It's everywhere you go. It's here in Mayapur. And it's even in places that you don't see. Next. Indirect propaganda. Now it begins to become a little interesting. It refers to that type where we're not aware of the objective and the purpose of the propaganda. Example, where my mother and her husband, my stepfather, they tried to show that these books that really were funded from foreign countries, but there were so many different ways in which that was covered. Very difficult to reveal these things. It's somewhat concealed, and the technique is to change views and ideas and beliefs and attitudes of people in a very tactful and subtle manner. ISKCON examples include how we use it: book distribution, bhakti yoga retreats. It's kind of a little bit, not direct. Prasadam distribution, stress management courses, and relationship and science seminars are often by devotees. Those are also examples of indirect propaganda. Next, please. See where I am. Okay, so now we have the conscious and unconscious propaganda. It's getting a little deeper. Conscious propaganda is done purposely and with some intention, like a Srimad Bhagavatam class. It's conscious propaganda. We're propagating the principles of Krishna consciousness. But in unconscious propaganda, the propagandist has no intention to propagate something. It kind of appears accidentally and unknowingly. For example, a teacher, not necessarily a Gurukul teacher, but any teacher, may have an agenda with his students, might be a pedophile. And that's an indirect kind of propaganda that doesn't immediately appear. I remember I had in the Boy Scouts, I always wanted to go in the car when we went to our camping trips with the Boy Scout leader. But he always picked 2 other boys. Many years later, I found out that he was abusing these children sexually. But who knew? It was so unconscious. So in education, the hidden agenda often is undetectable for long periods of time. Next. So we come across now what's called a Socratic method. Everyone familiar? Raise your hand if you're familiar with the idea of the Socratic method of learning. Okay, if you're not, we're going to give you a quick next. I cannot teach anybody, said Socrates, anything. I can only make them think. So, this really goes along with the idea of being independently thoughtful. If there was any 2 words that stood out for me and that I've, since 1986, when ISKCON kind of imploded and everybody who was following a certain type of thinking, you had to rethink all of your values. How did I get here? How did I support these kinds of activities and behaviors? And how am I going to avoid that in the future? Next. Different strokes for different folks. In the highest Socratic expression of the Western model, education has no ulterior or selfish motive, like propaganda does. And within social norms in which the education is offered, the Western idea is to increase the independent thinking and decision-making power of the individual. Next. So there's different types of schools. And in the Asian models, there's usually a little more emphasis on social responsibility. In the religious schools, there often is an exclusive exposure to dogma. Next. Now this Socratic kind of focuses on giving students questions, not necessarily answers. I mean, we give the answers, but Prabhupada was very pleased with this idea with Brahmatirtha of perfect questions, perfect answers, and it goes very nicely with the Socratic idea. Next. And we model an inquiring, probing mind by continually probing into subjects with questions. Next. Not unlike the questions of the sages of Nrsimhananda to Sukadeva Goswami. The difference is, and it's a really important difference to make, is that the sages accepted those answers as 100% authoritative. It was a descending knowledge from pure devotee. Next. I'll tell you a little story in that regard. In the 1970s, the Hare Krishnas, we were known as the people with all the answers. Really, that's how people in the US and Canada saw it. Oh, those Hare Krishnas, they know everything. And we were, because the world for us was very black and white. And our responses generally were composed just of repeating what Prabhupada said in his books. We didn't even have to understand it. We didn't even think we had to understand it. We just repeated it. And you know what? We grew pretty big. Next. By the 1980s, our children had become old enough to ask questions that we had trouble answering. How is Srila so-and-so a pure devotee if he's yelling at the devotees and calling them bad names? And those fake moon rocks, are they fake in the museum? And don't the horses carrying the sun get too hot? There was a multitude of questions we couldn't answer for our kids. Next. Well, bear with me. So as the absence of Srila Prabhupada's Vapu became longer, no, I'm sorry, you're one ahead of me. Go back. Yeah. As that became longer, the list of unanswered questions became more voluminous and quite ominous. That book, in Vaikuntha, Not Even the Leaves Fall, you can't believe the controversy that book created. You think that Vaishnava Diksha Guru is splitting the movement? That book practically split the movement. Did we fall from the Diksha? But no, it says back to Godhead. We were up in the spiritual sky. I remember Prabhupada saying blah, blah, blah. It was tough. And still is, actually, in some ways. So is it bona fide for ecclesiastical bodies to come between the guru and the disciple? Can Vaishnavis be gurus? Was the first moon landing a hoax, and all the other ones, they actually went to the moon? Next. We weren't the people with the answers anymore. We were really arguing amongst ourselves, which continues to some extent today. Next. And we were imperfect devotees and imperfect answers often. And our children looked to us for stability, but we could only offer our own interpretation after losing a sense of near certainty, which was there in the 70s and the early 80s. They were left to their own inquiry and realization. And our propaganda campaign became fragmented, it became disparate, and quite contentious. Next. Now, our Gurukulas still stress the dogmatic approach, which transitions to a more Socratic model as the child matures. And this hope, the hope is that the core values and beliefs instilled in those formative years stick. And I'm not going to question the issue of propaganda in early education. It's axiomatic that the parent has a prerogative to place their child in an environment that nurtures a belief system of their choice. But what is more interesting and what is more imperative is to ascertain to what degree and to what way our educational institutions continue propagandizing as the intellectual capacities come online with age. Next. Huh? No, I can see everything here. That's later. Go back. Yeah. Both education and propaganda communicate knowledge. But the knowledge communicated through modern education aims at finding and not knowing the truth. The student makes independent judgments, and the process of Western education is devoted to an inquiry of the truth and seeks to look at it at all sides of a complex problem. And the goal is to develop the critical faculty of the individual. Next. So on the other hand, propaganda offers ready-made ideas and hence discourages inquiry. So rather its sole purpose is to see that a person accepts. He would have to have been born as a saint, because thus in sum, education encourages free thinking and critical analysis of all respects, while the propagandist discourages such thinking. And in our case, that means cultivating acceptance of authority. That's what the propaganda is. And I don't know how many parents will be happy if their student or child becomes a sycophant of the teacher. They look to their child to have the same freedom of inquiry as they did coming to Krishna consciousness. Propaganda can also operate by sharpening a bias selection, a suppression, an emphasis or a distortion of relevant data, and denies a hearing of the rival approach. That's how it operates. You look at North Korea as an example. They try to shelter their people from information, and thus they're brainwashed. Next. And they can go with the tide of current public opinion. But education is never bound by public opinion in its most pure form. Next. It may go against public opinion in the interest of some long-term or permanent goals, such as becoming Krishna conscious. That's pure propaganda. Next. Although the educator and the propagandist are both concerned with the discrimination of information, they have nothing else in common. They use contrary methods and they strive for opposite goals. The propagandist is interested in what people think. The educator, how they think. This is the distinction. And the propagandist has a definite aim. He strives to convert, to sell, to secure consent, to prove a case, to support one side of the issue. He's striving for an effect, and he wishes people to come to a conclusion, to accept his case and close their mind and act. The educator strives for an open mind. He has no case to prove, which may not later be reversed. He's willing to be reconsidered, to be experimental, and hold his conclusion tentatively. Next. Prabhupada, try to understand your knowledge. Question, we're not pushing forcibly. You've got your intelligence, argument, logic, everything. Not that we are pushing it by force, that you have to accept it. Just like sometimes it's said, please, thank you. Sometimes it's said that the Mohammedans, they propagated on one hand the sword and on one hand the Quran. Either you accept the Quran or there's a sword for you. It's not like that. It's placed for your judgment. And if you like, you accept it. Otherwise, I came here empty-handed. I'll go back empty-handed. There's no loss, no gain. Again, for me, one of the most profound conversations Prabhupada's had with us, and I hope to live by that the rest of my life. Next. So I think we saw this, right, already? Although the educator and the propagandist are both concerned with discrimination of information, they have nothing else in common. We saw this. Next. Education places all the positive and negative aspects, pros and cons of any subject matter before the students, and this helps in enlightening rather than confusing them. There are no guarantees that anyone's mind will choose sadhana bhakti. Despite all the benefits of being educated in a Krishna-conscious environment, the majority do not take up the process of sadhana bhakti as a primary occupation. However, the education, though not Vedic in the sense of the student seeing the teacher as guru, the man with all the answers. Hello? Okay. So she said, why can't I see him? And she said, well, because he belongs to Krishna now, so you can't see him. She wouldn't let him in the temple. She wouldn't let my mother in the temple. Thus, my mother became one of the founders of the anti-cult movement in America. with good reason. I just want you to know, my mother traveled with me in India about 20 years ago, went to Vrindavan, took darshan, had her birthday there, came to Mayapur, went all over, stayed with the devotees, and she tells me that was the best trip of her life. So one may think that just because somebody has had some prior negative experience that they'll remain that way all their life. Not so. We've seen so many people who have been the victim of false propaganda, or just even in the form of one person's reticence to give up their bhakta to their mother. But that doesn't mean that that propaganda cannot be reversed in its effect. So that was the result in the final analysis of Prabhupada's mercy towards myself and my mother. Any other questions?
One last question there.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Thought-provoking. Prabhupada seems to indicate that there is negative propaganda that is against the purposes of our movement, and positive propaganda that he wants us to do on behalf of our movement. So how does that reconcile with letting people come, have their own conclusions? Are we supposed to help lead people to the conclusion of Krishna consciousness?
I'm not quite sure exactly what your issue is. Is your issue propaganda, or the use of propaganda, or our understanding of the use of that propaganda?
It seems from Prabhupada's statements, especially that list of all the types of propaganda, that Prabhupada was in favor of us using propaganda to convince people of Krishna consciousness. So how do you reconcile that with, people can, just kind of figure it out for themselves, or like,
Prabhupada never wanted to force anyone to do anything. He wrote my mother, when my mother said, I want my son to send my son back. She wrote him.